Hi stamping friends, welcome to Melissa's Crafting Treehouse. Today's project was created for the January 2020 Color Challenge and Color Fusers blog hub. This is also one of my 3 club and free card kit projects for January and February 2020. The color challenge today is Blueberry Bushel, Rich Raspberry, Basic Gray, and Black. In this video, I'll be featuring the new Parisian Beauty Stamp Set with the sponging and masking techniques. You'll learn a couple of ways to customize the color of your ribbon, plus you'll find out why you might actually want to eat caramel while crafting, and the beauty of making a mistake. For this card, I experimented with doing it in a couple of different ways. For this first version, I used jet black StazOn, inked up my Eiffel Tower image, and stamped it on a piece of Whisper White cardstock. So next I'm going to create a mask using some art masking tape. I'm taking a piece of cardstock here, putting it on the back side of the art masking tape, and then punching a 1.5 inch circle. Now the cardstock just helps to make sure you get a cleaner punch. And then I'm going to remove the art masking tape from my punched circle and place it over the top of my Eiffel Tower image. Next, I'm going to be sponging my sky using Blueberry Bushel ink. Now this is a pretty dark ink, so I'm not pressing super hard. And I'm just going to do that Blueberry Bushel over about 3/4 of that focal piece. Next, I'm coming in with my Rich Raspberry, and that's going to be sort of my horizon, sort of pink sky. And then I'm just going to keep coming in with my sponges to adjust the color. So now I'm doing my Blueberry Bushel again, focusing mostly on the outside edges of the cardstock piece to make those darker, to give some drama to the focal piece. And I like to leave the area between the Blueberry Bushel and the Rich Raspberry almost white, to get the effect of one color sort of fading into the other. So now I'm removing my mask, and of course it's supposed to look a bit like a moon in the sky. And I'm taking a little bit of smoky slate ink and coloring the moon just a little bit so it's not quite so stark and white. And then I'm going to use a little bit of my basic gray, ever so slightly, to create some darker areas on the moon. Now another option for masking is to take the negative punched out piece, as I have here, and then sponge the other way. Now this would be especially useful if you had a pale or lighter background. Maybe you were doing a pinkish sky and you didn't want the gray to show on that pink sky. Now for this focal piece, the next thing I did was I pulled out my clear Wink of Stella brush, which essentially gives me a little bit of a subtle shimmery look on my image, and it also blends the color as well. So I'm coloring in my whole moon, and then I'm going to go ahead and color in the Eiffel Tower image. Now again, that's going to blend the colors that are sponged in behind the Eiffel Tower as well, and that just also helps to make it stand out a little bit more. This is a very delicate, detailed image, and I want to make sure that it stands out against the sponged background. For this next version of my focal piece, I'm using shimmery white cardstock, and I'm going to heat emboss this image. So I've used my embossing buddy on the paper to start with, and I'm inking up my Eiffel Tower with Versamark and just stamping it on my focal piece. The embossing buddy has a powder in it that acts as an anti-static on the cardstock, and that is to ensure that specks of the embossing powder don't stick on the paper where they don't belong. And then I'm going to heat emboss the image using black embossing powder. Now this will allow this relatively subtle fine line image to be a little bit more bold and stand out a little bit more. With the heat embossing, it'll also be a little shiny and raised, and the black will just be a bit darker as compared to the jet black StazOn. So I'm just heat embossing my whole image, Now I find that the black embossing powder is a little bit more sensitive to heat, so you want to be especially careful not to overheat it so it doesn't burn. If it burns, you'll lose the shine and the raised effect of the heat embossing. So just like with the last focal piece, I'm going to mask using my circle to create the moon, and sponged in the blueberry bushel and then in the rich raspberry down towards the bottom. Now the shimmery white cardstock is not quite as bold a white as the ultra smooth white cardstock, so this focal piece sort of turns out a little bit more subtle and soft in look, and the moon in particular doesn't look quite as bright white to start with. Now I was all done with this focal piece, and I want to tell you a little story that involves caramel. So I was stamping while I was hanging out with my daughter, and she had an ice cream sundae with a little bit of caramel in it, and the caramel had stuck to the bottom of her bowl. It was sort of hard as a rock, so I decided I would take my heat tool and try to melt it a little bit, which worked just beautifully. But in the process, I ended up getting a little bit of caramel on my finger, and then the caramel ended up on my focal piece, this very focal piece that you see here. It was so beautiful. So the little dot of caramel was in the lower left-hand corner, and I tried a couple of things to fix the problem. I took my aqua painters and tried to color, but then it blended the color in just that spot and not over the whole surface. And so in the end, I ended up deciding, okay, well, I'm just going to spray the whole thing with some water and just see what happened. Now I thought I had ruined my focal piece, and in the end, after spraying it with the water, this is what it turned out to look like. So this is a perfect example of what I like to call a happy accident, something that you think is a mistake that ends up producing a really beautiful result. Now if I had sprayed the water on a piece of Whisper White cardstock, it might not have worked so well. The shimmery white cardstock handles water a whole lot better. So if you decide to try this and use the water effect, you'll want to be using either watercolor paper or shimmery white cardstock. So here are my two focal pieces side by side. For the two focal pieces I just showed you, they were already matted on pieces of basic black cardstock. Now the sample that I'm attaching right here is in fact the version on shimmery white cardstock, so I had already mounted it to the black piece before I sprayed it. Now that's not ideal, of course, but in the end it worked out okay. So now all I have left to do is dye my ribbons and assemble my card. So I'm going to start with attaching my blueberry bushel strip to the left side of the card, and I have left a small edge of the basic gray showing on the left. So for this project I've used two different ribbons on the card, and both of them are dyed. Now I've experimented with 4 different ways to color ribbon, and there are pros and cons to each of them. My least favorite method is using ink pads with a sponge, and that's simply because it takes a long time for the ink to dry, and there's a much higher likelihood that you'll get ink on your project in places where it doesn't belong because it hasn't dried yet. So the easiest and simplest way is to use a Blends alcohol marker and just color directly onto your ribbon. In this case I've got my lace trim right here, and this works beautifully. It dries really quickly, gives you rich color. Here I'm using my rich raspberry, dark rich raspberry Blends alcohol marker. The downside to using a Blends alcohol marker is it's really rough on your marker, so you may not want to be doing a high volume of using your blends in this way, but it is very effective. Coloring on the lace trim with the Blends alcohol markers is definitely harder on the marker than on the ribbon you see here, which is the crinkled seam binding ribbon, which is very smooth and supple. The final 2 methods for coloring your ribbon involve reinkers and rubbing alcohol. You can take some droplets of reinker and put them directly into a spritzer bottle like this one, and add some rubbing alcohol and just mix it up and spray. Now this works beautifully if you're just doing a few, but if you're doing some quantity, you might want to mix your rubbing alcohol and droplets into a container and put your ribbon directly into that, and then just pull it out and allow it to dry. It will dry pretty quickly because it's alcohol, and that's one of the greatest benefits of using the alcohol. And if your ribbon isn't quite dark enough as this one here, just add some more ink droplets to your alcohol and then put it right back in. Now, because I'm doing this project with a couple of my club groups, we're going to be doing quite a bit of dyeing of the ribbon, so I'll be using this method for my in-person classes. If you choose to use this method, you may need to play around with how many droplets of the ink that you use to get the depth of color that you prefer. And then it'll take maybe 10 minutes or so for your ribbon to dry. It will depend on how thick the ribbon is. The lace trim will take longer to dry than this thin seam binding. Now all I have left to do is assemble my card. So I'm just going to tie my dyed gray ribbon around the spine of my card. And I like to tie it nice and tight, and sometimes the card will even bow a little bit, and that's just because I want to make sure that my ribbon is good and snug. And I'm bowing the cardstock there in order to move the knot up a little bit higher, and then just trimming off the ends of the ribbon. Now I've already put dimensionals behind my focal piece, and the next thing I'm going to do is put some glue dots along the edge of the focal piece so I can attach my lace trim, and I'm putting 4 glue dots on there. Now I'm holding the edge of the glue dot against the edge of the cardstock to make sure the glue dot is really close to the edge, so it'll be right where it needs to be in order to attach the lace trim and not have the glue dot exposed where it isn't supposed to be. And now I'm just placing my focal piece down onto the lace trim so that it's straight, and so the portion of the trim that I want to be exposed is showing. And then I use the edge of the cardstock against my scissors to trim off the excess ribbon. Now all I need to do is attach my focal piece and make a few final little adjustments, and my card is all finished. I hope you've enjoyed my project today, learned something new, and are inspired to go make beautiful cards out of your happy accidents, whether it involves caramel or not. If you like this color scheme, make sure to check out the Color Fusers blog hop. You'll find a link to my blog post in the video description below. As a reminder, this is one of my club and free card kit projects. Click on the link in the video description to learn how you can get free card kits. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with friends, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining me today, and happy crafting!